Okay, I just wanted to start first by saying that this is a trigger alert. I will be discussing on this episode themes like sexual assault and things of that nature. So just a heads up if this is something that you are uncomfortable hearing, I understand. But for those who feel compelled to continue listening, I do appreciate that. That you do take the time to listen and hear me out. I think that this is important. I think that these sort of topics need to be addressed, and it's not just specifically about sexual assault. This episode is about women in general, how we are socialized in the society, the things that we are programmed to accept, and understanding that just because you are a consciousness that exists in the vehicle of a female body doesn't mean that you automatically should be subservient or that you come second to anyone. Okay? So this is an important topic. It's for, everyone, but I'm speaking specifically to my female listeners. Okay? All right. Thanks for listening. Let's go. Okay, so today's episode is going to be slightly different. I had another plan for what I was going to discuss today. It's going to be largely centered around some comments that I received on the Discord channel as well as on the YouTube channel. But then I had a friend, a close friend, call me today, and we were having sort of like a casual conversation about her life when she sort of mentioned to me that she had recently had an interaction with a guy at her place that sort of crossed the line, from sort of friendship and casually getting to know each other into essentially coercion and, in my opinion, sexual assault and ultimately rape. The problem is that she is from a culture in the Middle East where women don't have a lot of rights. And that sort of behavior would probably be considered more normative. I mean, it's until recently that rape culture sort of was also normative in this country. So I'm not making that distinction that, the West is somehow better or more morally upright than the Middle East. But I'm saying that the socialization of what is sort of publicly accepted versus what happens in private in the West are slightly different. And she expressed herself clearly and said, I don't want this to happen. She said no. Which I guess I should have started by saying trigger warning. Discussions about sexual assault will be occurring on this conversation, on this podcast episode. So I will try to put a warning at the beginning of this episode as well. But she, was very clear and said, I'm done. Like, I don't want to do this. And this thing, I don't want to call this person a human being, but this entity just kept going. Anyway, despite her clearly expressing her desire to stop. And ultimately what she said was that, there was somebody in the other room, her roommate, and she had all these thoughts kind of racing through her mind as to not wanting to be loud, right? So that's how women are socialized, right? To be quiet. Okay, so we can't be loud, or we are labeled as loud, belligerent women. But if a man does the exact same thing, he is bold and a leader, right? So she was afraid of being loud. And she was also afraid of being rude, right? Because if a woman is assertive and states her opinion and says clearly, I don't want this, or I do want this, right? She's considered, or she's labeled a bitch. But if a man says the exact same thing, I don't want this, or I do want this, he's considered strong and assertive, right? And confident, right? So just off the jump, on a subconscious level, we have all of these sort of things that pull at women, that keep us silent and cause us to suffer in silence. And after the, altercation, he left, and she was left to process what had happened. And she, because of, we're all victims of the internal monologues, which I talked about it at great length in the episode called the An Irreverence for Suffering. So we're all guilty of this. So she sat back, and with very little evidence, her internal monologue presented or spun a story saying that somehow that she caused that to happen, right? That it was her fault, right? That she invited him over, and, had asked him to her bedroom. So somehow that was her fault. And while I commend any individual who looks at a situation and says, what could I have done to prevent this from happening? In that particular situation, and in these particular situations, it's not your fault. It's not your fault when somebody crosses that line, that boundary, and takes from you in that way, right? Right? It's the fault of the individual whose psyche is fundamentally damaged, right? For whatever reason. You can say that this man is a victim of the patriarchy. You can say that he is whatever. I honestly no excuses for that, especially in 2021. Like, are we serious? And no, this is not going to turn into, because I can sort of see some of the male listeners raising an eyebrow, although I don't know if I give a shit, because this is going on right now, and it may make you uncomfortable, certainly off the beaten path of what I normally discuss, right? And if it makes you uncomfortable, that's really something you need to look at, right? But you have a mother, and you have sisters, and you may end up having daughters that will experience these sort of situations if we don't collectively talk about this, address it, and stop it from happening. So, I have mentioned in past episodes The Will to Change by Bell Hooks. It deals with how toxic masculinity impacts and affects and causes and leads to male pain, right? Toxic masculinity makes it so that a man essentially becomes dehumanized in our society, in any society where this is prevalent, however you want to say it, okay? So I've addressed that, right? I'm grateful that the younger generation, the millennials and Gen Z and then things of that nature, we are sort of growing into ourselves and recognizing that we are individuals first before whatever gender we express ourselves as, right? So before I am a female, before, one is a male, they are an individual consciousness having a human experience in the form of a particular vehicle that may happen to possess a particular type of genitals. I am not automatically subservient to someone else simply because they have literally an enlarged clitoris. That is all a penis is an enlarged clitoris, and testicles are nothing more than ovaries that have descended. So in a way, this is a planet of females. Okay, so it's disturbing to me when I hear these sort of stories. One, because obviously when a woman, a person, because this doesn't only happen to women, but when a person expresses that they would rather not cross a particular line and another individual decides to cross that line anyway and impose their will over others, that is a violent act. And in these particular situations, it is a psychological sort of pain being inflicted, and it's an emotional kind of pain being inflicted that is harder to process than, say, somebody just slapped you across the face or punched you, because at least you can deal with that. Right? It's tangible. It is something. It is a pain. It's an attack on your physical form. You know where the pain is. You can pinpoint at it. It's here. And then you can start healing it. But when a person does something like that fucks with the person's psyche, that fucks with this person's self-perception, that fucks with their perception of reality, that is violence. And it angers me. I don't know who needs to hear this, but that's typically not how this podcast works. So for those of you who are new, this is a stream of consciousness. All episodes are. I very, very rarely sit and write out what I'm going to discuss. I turn on the mic and I start talking. And whatever comes to mind is what I say. And I had plans to discuss something else, like I said, but this is more pressing. I just feel like somebody needs to hear this. Just because you are in a female form, just because you are consciousness who just happens to be presently inhabiting and operating a female body, does not mean that you are second to anybody else. It does not mean that your thoughts, your opinions, your ideas, your perspective, your happiness, your desires matter less than anybody. We are socialized. We in the female form are socialized, programmed to put other people's needs ahead of our own. Women have literally died simply because from birth, we are conditioned not to be loud. We are conditioned not to be rude. And in order to avoid stepping on anybody's toes or trying to keep the peace, or really in order to be considerate of other people's feelings, we suffer unnecessarily for people who aren't being considerate of our own. You know, what she said to me was, I didn't want to be rude. I didn't want to be rude. And I gently said it back. Friend, he was being beyond rude in that act of not listening to you when you clearly said no. And those sort of toxic human beings don't care, right? They go in and take what they want. So at that point, you fight like hell to protect yourself. Be fucking rude. Say what you want. Women, please, get in the habit of speaking your truth. You know, slight sidebar, in the previous episode, I caught a little bit pushback. A couple of people came in and they said X, Y, and Z or whatever. And when I talked about, was it Hunger Games, Squid Games, or Squid Game. And that was my opinion. And look, you're welcome to your opinion, to say, that you disagree. That's absolutely fair. And that's fine. But it was more an exercise in, this is an uncommon opinion. This is also my perspective. And I'm seeing things, not even I am seeing things based on what I have studied extensively. I am seeing things at play that other people are missing, will miss, might miss. And I have the courage, it takes courage to speak against the grain. When somebody used the terminology hype, when everybody is being hyped into a particular position, to stand up and say, something's going on there, and let me tell you what I see, takes courage. To speak strongly about anything already takes courage, but to do so as a woman, I've seen this happens also a lot on a lot more. The YouTube is actually pretty friendly with the comments. There are a couple of people that will be like, well, da 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 da, and I guess in their defense, I did call them dumbasses. I said, whoever has gone and bought the tracksuit with the white Vans, thinking you're being unique, for Halloween, you've just been coerced or no, coerced is not the right word, but you have certainly been manipulated, by this show. And that was its intent. And, we got a good bit of friendly banter because it's, it's the regulars here so far that are listening on the YouTube, but the TikTok, and it's regulars on the YouTube who've, a lot of you guys have listened for years. On the TikTok, it's just I pop up on somebody's, For You page, and I say something, and people are just, and by people, I mean the ones, the males, feel some type of way, right? Because from birth, they are conditioned that they are superior. So to see somebody that you've been conditioned, not just because of my gender, but also because of the color of my skin, and also because of the age in which I appear to be. A lot of men feel compelled to comment and tell me that I'm wrong or that I don't understand something that I've spent 15 years of my life studying. And when I present them with lists of books, this is not everybody, okay? The majority of people are respectful and kind, and I'm grateful for that. But for these people, when I present books, it typically, they do one of two things. Either they stop responding or they double down. I had one person say, I'm not going to read that. And this person literally said, I don't read because I don't want to be moved by other people's opinions. And if that wasn't the craziest thing I'd ever heard, okay, then first, why are you commenting on a video expressing your opinion? 2, I am giving you the resources for you to read and form your own opinion, because you're coming at me and telling me that this and this theory is wrong. And I'm saying, well, perhaps that is your opinion, but here's about 7 books of people who are lettered and study this for a living, saying the exact same thing I'm saying right now. And your response is, well, I'm not going to look into that. So then it's not about the content. It's about who is presenting it, right? So your wee little ego felt triggered in some way, and you felt as though it was your place to try to put me in my place, which is below you, simply because you are male and of a particular ethnic group. Stupid. Absolutely stupid. I will continue to speak my truth. I will continue to speak my opinions. I don't give a shit. And honestly, like at this point, it's a matter of survival. I will not survive I cannot survive in silence. I cannot thrive in silence. There's so many other sources of pain in my life from having a body and having a mind that, while it's a brilliant mind, right, that is capable of such creativity, also suffers chemically, right, because of, being born or developing, right. My mind is a mind that has ADHD. Okay, so if you listen to me talk, please recognize that I'm intentionally creating space between myself, my body, and me. Okay, I am not identifying with my physical form. I am approaching it very intentionally, by the way, to say this is my body's mind, right? And this is a function of the body, of this particular body, without being too intensely attached to it or too intensely identified with it, right? When I talk about things like consciousness and shifting reality, sometimes I still get people messaging me saying, well, are you saying that what happens to your body then? And that tells me that that's an individual who it still hasn't clicked for them, that they are not their body. Your body dies, it rots. If you have an iPhone and you drop it, it's broken. But your iPhone, in a way, is not necessarily the physical actual phone. Because at any point in time, if anything happens to the physical form of your phone, you can take the data, so long as you're backing it up every night, and transfer it to a whole new phone, to an updated phone. That is what's going on a macro level. Right? And so that data, that sort of non-corporeal data that sort of floats through the cloud or whatever, to the various servers, it's just out there, information kind of passing through us right now, right, is akin to what one would call the consciousness of your phone. So this episode, it is important that we do create some sense of separation. I am not a person. I'm not a human being. I am a consciousness having an experience as a human being, having a human experience. And so it's like a vehicle, right? You are not a Jeep, right? You are a human being having a Jeep experience, right? Driving a Jeep. Now, if your Jeep has certain problems, that is not your problem. That is your Jeep's problem. Okay, so my body, my human body, is not me. It's just a vehicle that my consciousness is experiencing, right? This sort of simulated reality with. Okay, so this body, right? Let's say it's CPU, right? It's mind, it's predisposed to depression and ADHD. It's just a thing that it does, right? Just kind of like my iPhone. Sometimes the screen just goes dark for no reason, even though I have it on the brightness. I don't know why it does that, but that's just how my phone does. And when it does that, I know, all right, just, unplug it from the charger. It only happens when it's plugged into the charger. So I unplug it from the charger and let it just kind of figure its shit out. And then eventually the light comes back on again. Okay. And I've looked this up and people have said do this, that, and the other. I've tried everything. It's just a thing my phone does. It is what it is. Okay. So my body, same thing. This body, Jolie, that is what it's called. And I am a consciousness that is having an experience through the avatar, Jolie. And every once in a while, Jolie experiences depression. And every once in a while, Jolie experiences she just has bouts of anxiety. And one of their functions is ADHD. But the thing is, what makes her, I'm going to pull it all together, by the way, in case you're like, whoa, was she off on a tangent? I'll put it all back together. But what sort of is, a weakness in a way, that ADHD is also a strength, right? Because it allows for me to be able to utilize this body to paint, to podcast, to write, right? To TikTok, to engage in all of these different sort of avenues, because of the ADHD, right? And it's also sort of what makes this persona, this avatar, Jolie, interesting. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. So, but to internalize observations that the mind of Jolie makes or picks up and not speak on it in order to avoid, right, pissing people off, right? It's just not something that I can do. Yeah. One of my primary functions, or one of Jolie's primary functions. So I'm speaking in third person intentionally because I want you guys to get into the habit of doing the same thing. So I'm not referring to myself in third person, like in a sense of, or out of a space of arrogance, but from a place where I want you guys to understand that in order for you to understand things like shifting and, parallel universes and many worlds interpretations and everything like that, you do need to create a separation from form. Okay. And I'm not the only person saying that. We've talked about this. By we, I mean collective humanity has discussed this since beginning and probably before recorded history. Okay. Look up etymology of avatar. It tells you, all right. It's a god. The form of a god, a human form of a god, right? The physical form of a god that it uses to sort of experience reality. So this is not new. But I want to get you guys who aren't as familiar with these sort of discussions to separate from form. But another thing that I'm attempting to do here is to really, really get you to understand that we are all fucking equal. If we're just consciousness having different experiences in different forms. So the fact that there even exists a sort of weird dichotomy between man and woman in our society, I'm not saying that, there isn't a place for, quote, gender roles. I don't know. I'm not judging that. Some people are comfortable with that for whatever reason. And this is not my place to challenge that. You do what works for you. Okay. But understand that even when you are subscribed to gender roles, you are playing a role, right? You are not, if you are playing a role as, father of the house, man of the house, I bring home the bacon. Okay. That does not make you inherently superior to your female counterpart simply because her body, right, her consciousness is uploaded or exists within a vehicle that possesses a vagina. Okay, she's not subservient to you. She is not your slave. You do not own her fucking body. You're both actors just playing different roles. The problem in society that I've observed is that people are lost in their roles. Okay? Sleepwalking. Goddamn NPCs, right? They believe that simply because they are, their vehicle is their avatar, right? Avatar vehicle, their body is of a particular age that makes them superior. We're all consciousness. There was no beginning. There is no end. Consciousness always exists. So the hierarchy here is bullshit. It's an imposed set of moralities, an imposed set of laws that we made up by the way. So they were made up by human beings. Whether or not we have, religious texts to try to tell us that it was the gods that gave it to us, no, it was us. And if you study enough theology from an objective perspective, and a historical perspective, what a lot of theologians and historians also have noted is that a lot of what people called gods were just ordinary human beings at one point in time. And that's just from a non-esoteric approach, okay? Like we could claim, for example, I'm going to start with let's start with the East and talk about Buddha. Buddha was literally just a prince, right? He was born into a, relatively wealthy household, and he was living his life, but he was a human being. And then certain circumstances caused him to, leave his family and go sort of on his pilgrimage, and eventually he gained enlightenment. But now he's almost venerated as a type of God, right? There's statues of him everywhere. People make offerings to him. People pray to him. People repeat and hold sacred his teachings. But he was a human being. Okay. Now let's sidestep to Christ. That was a human being. Yes, he claimed to have been the Son of God, but he also said, so are you. And he included the collective into that grouping. And somehow that got lost in translation, and he became the only Son of God, even though he never made that distinction, right? Pre-modern translations, okay? And bear in mind, too, that a lot of the texts that we have now, that people are basing their whole entire existence on, were written 200 years after the fact. Like, imagine, and literally, podcasts didn't exist, right? And I just was a teacher in California, okay? And I made some moves within the California area. I mean, California is a pretty big state, right? But it's, it's California. And X, Y, and Z, something happened. And, 200 years later, somebody took the sort of what was written about me. These books weren't written by people who were actually there, right? A lot of them. And if you read, for example, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's a lot of incongruencies, okay? Kind of common sense there. It's just nobody's really talking about it. And a lot of stories don't match up, right? If somebody took my life and they decided they needed to write an autobiography of me, you wouldn't have those stark differences from author to author. What happened is what happened. But we see that right there. Just read it. You don't have to read the entire Bible. Go to the New Testament, read the first, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and see that there are a lot of discrepancies that don't match up. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that it was written ages after he passed. How can you write a story, a legitimate story about somebody that you've never met, right? But he has been turned into a god, and now we worship statues of him. The same thing, the same treatment. But bear in mind, too, a lot of the stories, a lot of the historical aspect, if there was really an individual named Yeshua, a lot of historical aspects were sort of pulled regionally from sort of regional this and then applied to his life story to sort of amplify the claim that he was the Messiah. Like there's a wealth of information out there that you can sort of confirm what I'm saying here. Okay. Even the fact that people say that he was born of a virgin, a lot of theologians are saying that word virgin has been misconstrued, and it actually meant just a young maiden. That's it, a young lady. But that's been lost in translation, or has sort of like a game of what's it called? Chinese. I forget what that word is. Chinese is a game where you whisper from one person to another. I forget what it's called. But anyway, like that. It has sort of evolved into, or devolved in a way. The truth has changed into he was born of a virgin. But you see a lot of these stories echoed in Egyptian mythology, which predated Christianity. You see the same thing in like Middle Eastern theology, which once again predated Christianity. And you see that in Greek, like in Mediterranean theology as well. So the writers, 200 years after the fact, decided to just pull whatever was kind of cool at that moment. And I get it, because that's what artists do when you're creating something. They just pull, from whatever, the cult of Dionysus, all of these things, right? The story of Osiris, all of these things were kind of pulled together to create what people believe now. But this was of a man who some have even theorized that he studied in the East and must have been influenced by Hinduism and Eastern philosophy. But some people don't want to hear that, right? Others have said that he was Essene, I believe that's a term. But still, this was a human being that has now been venerated as a god, okay? So I'm saying all of that to say this, that in our bodies, we are all the same. We're all consciousness experiencing life through different vehicles, even the gods, right? So even the gods were once human, right? And then history turned them into something as we understand them now. I've even had theories that what was written about in sort of the older religious books, I'm going to pull it all together. In the older religious books, what was written about, like even, for example, the Old Testament, because that's just what pops into my mind right now. In the book of Ezekiel, where we see where some people have theorized that he might have been writing about like a UFO, like an unidentified flying object, right? And then about time standing still and things like that, or the sons of man in the Old Testament, where people have come to understand that the Nephilim, for example, were children of the angels. But if you take a different approach and you reread that and retranslate it and look at a different translation, the Nephilim could just be essentially the same as demigods that was in the Mediterranean philosophy, right? You've heard of Hercules and right? They were sons of gods, and by gods, bear in mind what I just said, that these gods were literally just great men. That's all they were. That's all they were. I do have a theory, right? Because it's all sort of a cycle. Everything in this life is a big circle. It's all a loop. It's all a big loop. I do have this theory that something like we continue, and maybe not even our timeline, okay? But I do have this theory that we continue, kind of marching towards a future where we were technologically advanced. I got a couple people mention this in the Discord, and a lot of people have been messaging me about seeing themselves in a technologically advanced future. I don't have the time to respond to everybody. I actually sort of got overwhelmed. I used to try to take the time to, communicate and talk to as many people as I can, but it's almost like too much. But I am still active in responding in the Discord and in the YouTube, so you can reach me there. But a theory that I have is that in the future we become so technologically advanced, but then something happens. Maybe eventually an actual asteroid does impact the Earth, or they figure out that it's all a loop, and they become so technologically advanced that they can actually prevent people from shifting or control the shifting process and transfer their consciousness through black holes, through wormholes, which, while it sounds weird, Michio Kaku did talk about this in his book towards the end, not directly what I'm saying, but it's inferred in one of his books. I think it's called The Future of Humanity or whatever, that perhaps DNA came from like a parallel universe through like a wormhole. I'm just taking that shit and running with it. But I would say that the gods, that the ancients wrote about were nothing more than technologically advanced humans from the future, perhaps from a parallel universe even, but still Earth, found a way to transfer their consciousness back through time, maybe through a wormhole or whatever, in microscopic forms, and then essentially reseed the same planet over and over again. So like our end is also our beginning, and the loop just cycles over. So that the gods that are written about in the ancients, that seem to be, all of these ancient scripts seem to be describing even certain points like holy wars and things like that. It feels to me, from all of the religious texts that I've read, and I've read a lot, it feels to me like if I had no exposure to sci-fi, but I saw some shit, I would only be able to explain it according to sort of like my point of references, right? Chariots of fire, wings of dragons, like things like that, right? The soaring creature appeared to breathe fire, right? As like when you see a rocket ship, it looks like a dragon in a way that gives off fire, right? But it's like there was an advanced civilization. They came through to our past, and then those stories got passed on, like, because they didn't write things down, word of mouth. And once again, like a game of Chinese whispers. I don't know if it's called Chinese whispers. That feels racist. I don't mean it to be. But just the you guys know what I'm talking about, that game, where you whisper and it points out. So anyway, so like it just had been corrupted over time. So now we have a weird sort of understanding of what our actual history is. And funny enough, I got a message from somebody who I still haven't responded to. But I will probably, hopefully. And they mentioned in their email, it was an email, a Canticle for Lebowitz, which I started reading. And that has been an interesting read. And that's exactly what I'm talking about now. Like if something were, to happen to us, and actually I had mentioned this in a video before I'd even read Canticle of Lebowitz. I just sort of theorized the same exact thing. Like if something were to happen to us and we were taken out by like a nuclear war, right? Are the survivors, which there would be. Because people don't understand nuclear fallout. It doesn't necessarily take out like absolutely everybody, but it would be devastating enough, where it would wipe out a significant portion of the population, but not like every single human. But the people who would survive would be like, otherwise like they would be like deformed, or just like it would just be a miserable existence. However, there clearly would be people who remember what life was and remembered rocket ship and somehow wanted to preserve the fact that we had achieved what we had achieved in our present time in some way. But to describe it, like how hard, think about it. How would you describe a rocket ship to somebody in the future after we've have devastated our society who doesn't have a point of reference and does not understand a rocket ship? How, like, you would have to use terminology that would allow them to be able to understand or at least visualize what you mean, right? So you would say things like it was a giant bird that blew fire, right? Like you would have to use that. And that's what we're seeing in ancient texts over and over and over again. Yeah. So my theory about that, I'm telling you, I'm going to pull it all together because you're like, what does that have to do with what she was talking about in the beginning? Trust me, I have that in the back of my mind. I would say that even when what we think of as gods, what we called gods, even if they were venerated as gods, they were nothing more than human beings from the future, right? And a lot of the things that they did was probably, genetically modifying people and forms in order to have like suitable bodies, right, for them to experience this reality, right? But in the past, okay? That's what makes the most sense. And greater scientists than myself have basically theorized and written about the same thing, but like I said, not in this way. But I would say that the gods were always human. Right? If I went back in time with a particular type of technology, I would be venerated as a god. And the biggest, most telling thing about it all is that they kept having sex with people. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if I mentioned this in the previous episodes, but people who say to me, sometimes I get like a comment or something where people say like aliens think of us as like ants or animals in a zoo, right? My response is always, we don't try to fuck ants, right? And we certainly don't try to fuck our animals in the zoo, okay? Like, once you reach a certain level of like societal maturity, you just like, you don't do that. That's fucking weird, right? Because if you're advanced enough to like create a zoo or whatever and house certain specimen for study or whatever, which is what people seem to think this world is, you also would be advanced enough to mate with your own species and not go around trying to like fuck monkeys, okay? But yet, from Greek mythology, I love mythology. But from Greek mythology to like, Middle Eastern, I'm tempted to say Zoroastrian is what I'm trying to say. And then there's another one I can see, Sumerian, even African, Native American. It's the same underlining theme. They all look human, right? They all act human. They all have the same emotions and bullshit like human beings. It's just, they're just more powerful than us, which would make sense that they would be, from the future and possess more like greater technology than people in their past, like our ancestors, and thus would be venerated. But they would always the gods would always have sex with women, right? And then they would make demigods, right? So in my mind, it would make sense if, people from the future transfer their consciousness back, to the past to start the loop again at the end of time, so to speak. And it's all a circle. And then they showed up and, maybe in the future, not maybe, because that's where we're going. Like, one of the reasons why I love altered carbon, right? They figured out a way to transfer consciousness from body to body, or whatever. So people are essentially, what I'm trying to explain to you now, not detached to their physical form at all. There's more fluidity in that regard, and a greater understanding that you are literally just nothing more than like a stack in a sleeve. But in that stack is your consciousness. It's what you really are. And, age is basically, eradicated. But then obviously there's issues. But if you haven't, I think I'm going to watch Altered Carbon again today. I love the books. But just for that full of sort of like immersive effect. But yeah, so it's not wild to think about that. Like, think about what we're capable of now that people 100 years from now would have not even been able to imagine. And while we are arrogant, like teenagers, to think that this is the pinnacle of human evolution, especially in terms of technology, it's bullshit. 100 years from now, humans then would have figured out technology that's even more mind-blowing than what we have now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm sorry, but time travel, the reason why, we see them in the skies. Somebody broke this down to me and I liked how they explained it. But what they said was, from what they've been reading about how UFOs move, for example, they don't necessarily break the limit of speed, of light, faster. They're not going. So these sort of UAPs or whatever aren't traveling faster than the limit of speed of light, the speed of light. Sorry. They're not doing that, but they do appear to be able to bend the space-time around their vehicles. So they're not breaking laws, right? They're not breaking laws of physics, but they are sort of bending it, right? So they're not, so which tells me that then the aliens aren't like four-dimensional beings. They're actually, fourth dimensional beings rather, because they're still confined to our physical laws. They're just advanced three-dimensional beings. And I would argue that they're probably time travelers. And for whatever reason, they just don't directly interact with us, which is why people go, well, they can't exist because, well, they're not interacting with us. Well, maybe they understand based on whatever experience or simulations that they've run in their society, that if you do, it's like a little, like a butterfly effect, right? You would have to understand butterfly effects. And they understand that just altering something in one way could potentially destroy everything that they have worked for in the future. So they just sort of observe, and maybe they make different changes. Yeah. But not so direct as to completely throw things off a particular course or direction. That is what I'm thinking. But I'm saying all that to say that we're all equal. And I'm saying all that to say that if you're a woman who has been, especially if you're like an immigrant or daughter of an immigrant, or just haven't, or raised with parents who were just blinded by a particular sort of dogma in terms of how women should be socialized and who should and to be. Please understand that you are in a woman's body, but your consciousness having a human experience first. And if a man can cross a line and violate or attempt to violate you in a particular way, fuck that. Fuck his feelings, because clearly he's not giving a fuck about your feeling. This individual that is equal to you. They're not superior simply because they possess testicles and an enlarged clitoris, okay, and certain amounts of more amounts of testosterone, okay. If they're crossing a line, fuck being polite, fuck not being rude, fuck not trying to hurt their feelings, his feelings, because he doesn't give a fuck about your feelings. You are a consciousness having a human experience in a physical form of a woman. Assert yourself. You have every right to behave in the exact same way that our male counterparts have been conditioned to behave in terms of putting your needs met, having your needs met rather, and putting your needs first. You have every right to say, fuck that. And it's not just in those particular situations, but in everyday situations. If you're in a situation where you find yourself essentially dropping down your needs because your male partner is sort of overpowering you with his will, because not at his fault, but that is how he has been conditioned to program that, that is how he has been conditioned to behave, right? That's how he has been programmed to behave. So you have expressed a desire to do this particular thing, and somehow you end up in a conversation where it feels like you're almost asking him for permission when you know damn well that if the tables were turned, he would just do what he wanted to do because that's how he was socialized. This is the one thing that I told my friend today. One of the things that I told her today. I said, if you're ever in a situation where you're feeling a particular type of way, ask yourself, what would I do had I been socialized in the exact same way a man would do, right? Or in the exact same way as a man. Okay? What would a man do in this situation? It's not elevating them. It's not saying that they are superior. It's saying that we do live in a society that conditions women, right? Whether we want to admit it or not, it's kind of obvious. And it's so fucked up too, because if you do attempt to talk about anything that is, in regards to this, you do get kind of lumped into, oh no, we can't talk about that. That's feminism. Even though I can sit all day and I talk about male pain, and I talk about how, I want you to read The Will to Change so that you can at the very least understand, as a man, as a woman, understand what is really going on. And I also say, like, at the core of it, we are all human beings that are being fucked up by this particular mindset of toxic masculinity. It's bullshit that if you say things like toxic masculinity, it's almost like a liberal buzzword, and people just, I'm not a fucking liberal. I'm also not a fucking conservative. I'm an independent thinker. And I recommend that you don't pick a fucking ideology and then confine yourself to it and label yourself as such. Keep your eyes open. Okay? And be flexible. Those of you who've been listening, you know where I stand on a lot of things. Like I'm flexible. I'm not going to be pinned down or fit into any fucking boxes. Okay. But at this point in time, it doesn't benefit anybody. Okay. It doesn't benefit women to feel silence in this way. Right. Either it leads women to commit acts of self-harm because they feel less than, they feel like they're not being heard. They feel like they feel no sense of control because an entity, a male, their father, their husbands, whatever the fuck, are like asserting their dominance, their will over their own will. And it's a struggle. It's like nobody wants to be in prison. And it's like I said, it's a psychological thing. If one thing somebody tied your hands, then you would go, okay, my hands are tied. But when you are bound in a way by society, right? And by your expectations of behavior, be quiet. Don't be assertive. Don't express your opinion, right? Don't say something that, that people will disagree with as a woman. Just keep the peace, put other people's needs before these. Every single thing here is a chain, is another chain, is another chain. You have to be this way. You have to look this way. You have to dress this way. You have to have this type of body and have It's just another chain that confines and makes people miserable and scattered and unhappy and frazzled and lost. Cast these chains off one at a time. You're not going to be able to do this overnight. But I think the biggest thing, first of all, is recognizing that these chains are there because you can't see them, but they're there. But I need you to understand that you have every right to behave in the exact way that a man would in this society. You have every right to behave in the exact way. And I'm not talking about in the fucked up ways, right? Like the violence and things like that. I'm never, ever an advocate. So a lot of people missed that in the previous episode when I talked about Squid Game. I'm not an advocate for violence, just gratuitous violence. I'm never going to be a fan of that. Because ultimately we are human beings first and foremost, before we start getting split down to male, female, black, white, left wing, right, we are humans first. Do no harm. Of course, self-defense is a thing, okay? But any sort of program that conditions people that violence is the answer instead of communication, instead of, addressing these issues, discussing them, and fixing them in ways that actually long-term change the world, change society. I'm not a fan of violence. Okay. But what I mean by, if you were a woman and you were in the same exact situation, if you were a man rather, and you were in the same exact situation, how would a man behave? Would he put himself first? Would he be a little selfish? Would he say, no, well, this is what I'm going to do. You deal with it, deal with that, what you will. Would he say no? And mean that shit without being worried about being rude? Would he cut you off in the middle of a conversation if you're not getting what you desire from the interaction? Would you stand up for yourself? Would he? You have that same right. It's not going to be easy. A lot of us are in our 20s. A lot of us are in our 30s. And we were raised by mothers who are confined in that way. And you see them and they're angry, and I get it. But you can also be an example for them. To say, you know what? No, thank you. And call shit out. Hey, you're being manipulative. Hey, this is a weird fucking double standard. I am not going to do this. I don't want this expectation on me simply because why? Why should I accept this simply because Honestly, your clitoris is bigger than mine. Your dick is just an enlarged clitoris. So you really have to break it down and put it in those frames. Men have breasts. If that's the case, then, well, my tits are bigger than yours and I should be able to do X, Y, and Z. If you're saying that, well, because your clitoris, which is your dick, is bigger than mine, or you're physically stronger than me, you should be able to do X, Y, and Z. Well, I can tolerate more pain than you, so I'm emotionally stronger than you, and my tits are bigger. Okay? So these are different bodies. These are different vehicles. You don't get the right to run over me. You don't get the right to use me. You don't get the right to make me bypass how I feel about a particular situation, to prioritize your needs over mine. No. It doesn't have to be a protest on the street, holding signs and everything like that. That's okay. It's good to draw attention to that. But it starts by us saying, I'm just going to claim my rights. I have the right to be a human being. I have a right to be a full and complete human being. That my needs matter. That my opinion matters. That my thoughts matter. That my desires matter. That my pleasure matters first. Thank you for listening.